Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Platitude Era podcast. In this episode of the podcast, we will be reviewing the movie 1917. So, this movie got early release date to qualify for award season, Golden Globes, and the Oscars. So, there were a few people that got to see this movie, and those that got to see the movie talked about how great this movie is. Now, finally, the movie came out in wide release. We had a chance to see this movie, and now it's time to find out if this movie lived up to the hype, lived to the hype, or lived under the hype. So to begin, the movie 1917, it's a war movie, takes place during the lesser-known World War I, because everyone knows World War II, and World War II has been done to death. But it's time for us to learn a little bit more about World War I. And this group of soldiers, or less than a group, a duo of soldiers, are assigned with this task of going across a small stretch of land to meet with other soldiers to discuss a mission.
It's pretty reductionist, but sure, these one group of soldiers are going to go hang out with some other soldiers, if that's how you want to put it.
Well, I mean, I don't want to give too much away.
There's a party over in this one town in France, and these two guys really want to go because they really want to see the hot French chicks.
So it's kind of like Harold and Kumar?
No.
Go to France?
Because they just wanted burgers.
So one of the things that we understood why this movie had so much hype going around it, it had that impressive and difficult task of being a war movie with one continuous shot. The camera followed these soldiers around, so it took place in a day. So you can kind of say that they took the idea of Training Day, which was about two cops, and it followed them throughout a whole day. So it was two soldiers, and it followed them throughout a whole day, and it was
Bad
one
Boys comes out this week.
So what do you have to say about this movie?
Let's see. As far as other war movies go, I wouldn't consider this one my personal favorite. I think this will draw closer comparisons to Dunkirk from 2 years ago, I want to say. I think it came out in 17 or 18. We're in 20 already. Wow. Does this qualify for 2020, best of 2020, or best of 2019 movie of the year contention?
Ooh, that's going to be very hard.
Either way, it probably won't make it on any of our lists. But since they will draw a closer comparison between those two movies, I remember I liked Dunkirk at the time. I haven't really revisited it. But now that this has come out, I'm more interested in rewatching it. This one, I think, I'll draw an analogy later on. But for me, yeah, I really did enjoy this movie. It felt very personal and very, like you can kind of understand a mindset of maybe the era, the early 1900s, 1917, obviously. But just like, oh, these two guys have a mission and they're essentially against the odds, kind of. But they don't really face a ton of opposition. I mean, it kind of is just two guys walking around and stuff happens around them. But it felt pretty compelling. It felt you can kind of grasp a sense of what time was like, or for two young soldiers. You can imagine these guys were probably supposed to be like 17, 18, 19, something like that, pretty young. Thrust into this warlike conditions, and they're just like, oh, you have a mission, and you two young guys. Your mission is to save thousands of lives. Go, hurry up, chop chop.
And I'm glad you brought up the Dunkirk, because this movie, in the form of Dunkirk, was that every scene that goes on in this movie, it's suspense. From the first shot in the movie, you're on the edge of your seat, you're feeling the suspense, and as the movie progresses, you're still at the edge of your seat, you're still going through that suspense, and you're still like, oh my.
Yeah, I mean, there's, like I said before, there's not a ton of action per se. I mean, there's some action sequences, but it's not like it's not like the Normandy scene in Saving Private Ryan or anything like that. We're like, oh my God, this is like a battle scene, but it's just like two guys who kind of have to sneak behind enemy lines because they're behind enemy territory because that's where the Germans have retreated to. But they may have let traps around, or maybe you see German planes flying over. It's like, oh, they still have some presence here, and then the whole story is that the Germans were retreating just to lead the British into a trap. So they're aware of what they're doing. So they're letting British in, but who's to say, what's intended and what's not intended on the German side? What they're planning, because they did. There's one scene that's not a spoiler, but they booby trap a bunker. So so the Germans are pretty knowledgeable of what their plans are for the British. So it does have that kind of element of anxiety and suspense. You're like, we have to be careful. But, like, you're not just like holding the sprint button. There's a lot of comparisons that this movie's like a video game. They're not just holding the sprint button, like, oh, just run straight and then eventually you'll hit some Germans. It's kind of, more like a sneaking game almost. You're just kind of like, oh, we gotta slowly and carefully here, and then eventually, hopefully, we'll rendezvous with these guys. Hopefully, and then maybe have some semblance of safety, but we don't know for sure. But for now, it's just us two. Us against the world, War One.
And I'm glad that Sam Mendes took on this difficult task. He's done really well with some of the James Bond films, and by taking on this task, it shows how great of a filmmaker he is, as well as a storyteller, because I think he also wrote the story, which is interesting that this story, is based on a story he heard from his grandfather who served in World War One.
Is that the war? That's the war his grandfather fought in. He didn't make up a story about what could have happened in World War One.
We don't know. So that was interesting, and then it was just interesting how the story followed these two characters and the way the camera followed them. It kind of felt like, were we the third soldier?
Yeah, you could make an argument, or like, the documentarian. It almost feels like, you could say it's like Blair Witch Project or something. It kind of feels like a documentary crew. You're kind of fly on the wall, just kind of, buzzing around, like following these two guys, because it's very intimate. It's very like close quarters between these people. You don't really distance yourself away from these people, so it does feel like you're thrown into the same stuff as them. And I think that's kind of the intent of the movies, to be like almost like you're with these people if you don't identify completely. Like if you aren't them, you're pretty much thrown in the same mission as they are.
You're thrown in a way where you're not expecting war. I think earlier films, they would romanticize the war. They would talk about the killing or doing your duty or your battle. And in this one, it's a big war. It's the war to end all wars. And you still have that, that innocence with you. And as well as the characters, that they don't want to hurt anyone. They don't want to kill anyone. They're just following orders.
Yeah, they're just essentially just a couple of kids who are, this is the mission. They're like, oh, why did these kids get the mission? Because one guy can read a map pretty good, I guess. And so like, oh, this is such a dire mission. This is important because this is kind of I wouldn't say it's the end all be all for the war, but I mean, it's probably a pretty important battle in the sense that if we lose all these soldiers, then, it could turn the tide in the other direction. So, hey, you two guys, we need a very small crew, one guy in backup, and we need you guys to hot step it on over to like however many miles. It's not exactly a marathon, but you gotta go. You have until tomorrow at dawn. Hurry up. Thank God you can kind of read a map, I guess. But you're better you than anyone else, I guess.
And there's so many nods. I guess if you're a fan of history, or if you remember high school history when they talked about World War One, there's all these little nods to these things you remembered in class. I remember in history class, the teacher talked about when you're in the trenches, you're actually rude and you're mean to the new incoming soldiers, because during that war, being in the trenches, getting bombs dropped on you, you had a short life expectancy. People that your friends would die, somebody else would come in and replace them. And it's, oh, there's no point in getting to know this person because they might die or I might die.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of scenes just like taking place in trenches, and you can just see a whole bunch of soldiers just lined up, just looking miserable, and you don't really see a ton of camaraderie. They're not really like sitting by a campfire singing Kumbaya or anything like that. It looks like shit, and I'm guessing that's kind of how it was in the First World War. I mean, I think there's a little bit of more of a admiration, or specifically from Americans in general, like, oh, there's a like adoration, or like, oh, this is like the good old boys, the American way, when you think of like soldiers in World War II. But then you look at World War I, it's like, oh, this is like shitty and dirty and grimy and just looks horrible. And I wanted to, I guess, to capture a little snapshot of that.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this movie also had little elements of a horror movie. as you know, the camera or the characters are leaving the trenches and crossing the country, you see the destruction of war, you see the devastation. Pretty much there are these makeshift cemeteries because there's dead bodies there and they just leave them there. So it's as the bodies are piling up, there's this cemetery, and it's just really depressing how you have this young people, the youth, sent to war, they're following orders, they're killed, and then they're just left there.
Yeah, I mean, like, because it's like, because they show that brief bit during like the no man's land, and you just see just bodies strewn about, and you can't really do anything because that's the perfect time for the enemy to attack you. So it's just, oh, artillery strike, artillery strike. Well, we can't do anything. We're gonna have to retreat back into our trenches or something and just leave the bodies there, and then hopefully when this whole thing blows over, like they won't be completely covered in mud, so we can just retrieve them.
I can see them showing this movie, 1917, in school, in history class, this one, and Saving Private Ryan, to get an idea of the scope, how the war changed between World War I and World War II. I remember my history teacher saying that one of the big differences that happened between World War I and II was technology, how technology changed the invention of the machine gun.
Yeah, pretty much the only things to come out of World War I are trench warfare. Like it's a war of attrition. Like, oh, we've been fighting for months and we've gained 6 inches. And they show a little bit of that. I don't know if you noticed. I think that, at least I think that's what it was. They in the like when they're first going into the no man's land, they show two horses. There's like one that's closer to their trenches that looks kind of freshly dead, and then there's one a couple feet ahead of it, and you can already see you can see its bare skull. So it's like, oh, they've been here for so long that this first horse died months ago, but it's only like 2 feet away from this other horse, like showing just how much like progress or I guess regression has been made on the front lines. Just like, oh, we've only gathered this much ground, and then this is the passage of time that's happened. So it's just there wasn't much to do in World War One. It's just keep your head down. Hopefully, we'll shoot barrages of mortars or whatever, and then hopefully, we'll eventually pick off a couple of Germans here and there, and it's just a wait them out versus just, in World War II, it's like blitzkrieg and artillery and a whole bunch of stuff. So yeah, World War II is a more exciting war for cinema because you don't really see a ton of World War One because, there's much more technology involved in this one, and then for World War One, it seemed more like a patient chess game.
And now we're going to get into our recommendations. So we're curious what our friends at Rotten Tomatoes had to say about this movie. Critics on Rotten Tomato gave this movie a 90%. Audience gave it an 89%. What's your recommendation?
I mean, I personally, I wouldn't say a tremendous fan, but I tend to enjoy like the Oscar buzzy war movie whenever they come out, and this one kind of has that extra gimmick of oh, it's all in one shot. And World War One doesn't seem to be covered a lot because, like I said, it seems a little slower, a little less grandiose than World War Two for cinema. But I really enjoyed this. Like I said before, it's going to draw comparisons to Dunkirk. I wasn't the hugest fan of Dunkirk. I liked it at the time, but I feel like I got a little bit more out of this one just because the gimmick of the one shot was more impressive to me, and then just because it felt, it was kind of smaller in scope and it only focused on these two guys, it felt more intimate and it felt like you were thrown into the shit with these guys, So I felt like I got a little bit more out of the characters with this than I did with Dunkirk, which kind of like messed with time and did other things. I want to rewatch Dunkirk again, so I guess props to Dunkirk for making me want to rewatch it again. But as far as that, I think 1917, it's a simple story. You can reduce it down to guys want to go over there. But I mean, there's enough stuff that happens, and something as simple as this, it does keep your attention for its hour and 40-minute runtime, which is kind of brisk for a war movie.
My recommendation for this movie is don't miss it. This one is a crash course in World War I, the lesser-known war, and as well as the way that the film was shot, it made you feel like you were part of the group. You were on the mission as well, and it gives you that perspective about war, and I guess it's cliche to say it now, but it's something, the way that the world's going, to keep in mind that war is hell.